Welcome to Eye Contact, a video news program on issues and controversies in ophthalmology sponsored by EuroTimes. I'm Kristine Morrill. Social media is playing an increasingly important part in helping ophthalmologists communicate with their patients. Today I'm talking to Rod Solar of Livesey Solar Practice Builders on how eye surgeons could get maximum benefit out of platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Welcome, Rod.
Thanks.
So let's ask the easy stuff first. Why should ophthalmologists consider using social media?
Well, any question in marketing, including social media, depends on one's goal. So if an ophthalmologist is intending to market to millennials, for example, I would say that that's the primary target market when considering using social media as a channel in order to generate effective referrals. Millennials, obviously the typical things that one might be marketing to them is laser refractive surgery. When one considers looking at a market that perhaps is further aged, like Generation X, certainly they're very much on social media as well, but they're probably using slightly different social media platforms. So millennials tend to use more of the social messaging approaches, more pictorially based, live video, whereas Generation Xers tend to be more similar to their boomer relatives, where they use a lot of Facebook. And when you look at boomers, say for example, if you're marketing anything for the presbyopic market, or anything with the initial advance of age related vision loss, they're going to be mainly on Facebook. So that's going to be an area where it might make sense to invest. Now it's interesting because Facebook is a high trust environment as opposed to, say for example, Twitter, where you might interact with people you don't really know. But at the same time, millennials might not be, baby boomers might not be as connected as younger people are in social media. Therefore, paying for sponsored ads on Facebook might make more sense if you're trying to get the impressions you need in order to generate referrals. Now, if you're marketing services to traditionalists, which we refer to as people aged 73 and over, then in that particular circumstance, it's perhaps a bit of a stretch to expect that many of them will be on social media. However, let's not forget that their children are, and adult children do play a part in influencing their parents when it comes to deciding a provider. And they will most likely look at the social media profiles of their intended providers to see what they're doing and what they're up to and what kind of reputation they have.
Right. So it's very important then to think about breaking down the patient population and understanding what social media channels will work rather than assuming a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah,
there's going to go.
Absolutely. There's channels and there's also the messaging
Yeah.
In terms of how authentic one wants to be. Millennials love authenticity. They want you to be yourself. However, traditionalists might prefer a more idealized version of what a medical practitioner ought to look like and ought to sound like and what they ought to say. Right. So one's messaging and one's approach definitely changes, not just the channel. It
sounds fairly complicated. So who should be handling the social media in an ophthalmic practice, in any medical practice? Should the ophthalmologist be involved, or is it somebody designated in the team who has that kind of experience?
That's a great question. I think that the ophthalmologist can be involved if they have some familiarity with social media already. So here's a good test. If the ophthalmologist already enjoys social media, gets something out of it, they have a Twitter account, they perhaps relate to other people by retweeting messages or liking other messages. If they're on Facebook and they get a lot out of it, they understand the platform because they've actually lived there for a bit, then it makes sense. As well, I would also say that it might make a bit more sense in the millennial market because millennials are going to be a lot more forgiving of perhaps a surgeon's authentic traits, if I can put them that way. Whereas on the other hand, if you're marketing to an older market, it might be a little bit less interesting for them to get to know their surgeon too well, if that makes sense. They want that professional distance. They're used to that and they're comfortable with that. They don't need to know that the surgeon's going off and going to conferences even and doing other things other than taking care of them. So that's a consideration. So it makes sense if they're already familiar with social media and if they already enjoy it that they can have an involvement. And I think that authenticity does trump the distance in many cases. Now, alternatively, because many surgeons are time poor, And let's not forget, social media takes a lot of time to do properly. One can't just simply post a message here and there twice a week and expect to get any kind of return on that. So in order to look at the time investment, sometimes it makes more sense for somebody in the practice, again, somebody with an awareness of how the practice wants to be perceived externally. This can't be handed out to just the receptionists on their own time unless they have some training on it. Or especially not an intern who one can just simply say, oh, look, you've got a good Instagram account, why don't you take over our social media? We have to remember that this is a channel that represents the practice. It doesn't have to be all professional all the time, but certainly it needs to be communicating with one voice, one message that everybody can get behind. So yeah, either way, whether it's a surgeon or whether it's a practice manager or whether it's somebody in the clinic, they should know about social media, they should enjoy social media, and they should have a plan. If they have a plan, then they're more likely to do things regardless of whether or not other things get in the way. And we all know that in many practices, other things will get in the way. So that's the key.
Every year for the past 5-6 years, you and I have presented the practice development program, and one of us usually asks for a show of hands about who's using social media. And each year, a few more hands go up, but it's not everybody in the room. Should ophthalmologists feel that this is a must as part of their marketing today? Are you missing a segment of the population by not doing social media?
Yes. Yeah, I can be quite categorically sure about that. If you're not on social media, you are definitely missing an opportunity to communicate with a significantly large segment of the population. We know, generally speaking, that some people are, for example, whereas email used to be one's favorite communication channel of choice, many people that are 35 and under have almost abandoned email with the exception of professional use. So when they're doing things personally, when they're searching for medical advice online or they're interested in the types of treatments that they have an interest in, they're going to go to social media. They're going to use the channels that they're familiar with, and also they're going to interact with people who they know on social media. So absolutely, they are missing a trick if they're not on social media. I think it's vitally important. At the same time, we have to be realistic that social media is a channel that often leads to an engagement on a website that then can lead to an engagement over the telephone, which then can lead to an engagement in person, which is where you want the patient at the end of the day. We can't necessarily expect social media at the moment to be a generator of patients on a consistent basis. However, we know from looking into the future, and what I mean by that is looking into the Far East, where social media is now very, very popular and has been adopted widely, that people in the Far East are using social media to book consultations online. So because of that, because we see that, we know that typically what happens in the Far East is typically followed by America, and then what happens in America is typically followed by Europe, at least on the social media angle, and we can expect that to happen eventually.
What about ophthalmologists who have concerns about using social media from an ethical standpoint? And one of those areas would be engaging with potential patients who reach out via Facebook, Twitter, and trying to engage in almost the practice of medicine.
This is a very common concern, and I completely appreciate it because I think that ophthalmologists are, well, any doctor really is used to the environment of talking one-to-one with someone. So the typical use case that I try, or the scenario that I try to put to an ophthalmologist who has these concerns is like this. I say, imagine that you're sitting in your patient waiting room and you've got a whole bunch of patients in front, maybe about a couple dozen, and you're answering some questions. Perhaps it's like a seminar environment. Now take that environment and imagine that everything that's being discussed by the patients, prospective patients, and yourself is being broadcast on every single radio station in the area. Not only that, but there's also cameras, and they're broadcasting everything that's happening on television as well. So anything that you feel comfortable saying in that scenario, anything that you feel is necessarily private in that scenario, that's what you have to imagine is the potential scope and reach of social media. I'm not necessarily saying that social media is as ubiquitously seen as television or heard as radio, but it has the potential to be. So if something happens on social media that captures the attention of people to the point where it goes viral, and we've all seen and heard things that we all laugh at and sometimes groan at and grimace at, this is definitely not what we want to do if it's something we don't want representing our practice properly. So yes, I can appreciate that concern, and I would just simply advise ophthalmologists that if there anything they might say in a public setting needs to be considered equally to the way they might say it in a social media setting. I think with that rule in mind, they really can't go wrong.
And finally, Rod, what are the new social media platforms, the new trends that are coming on the horizon? You mentioned that millennials don't really use email anymore. They're into messaging, that type of thing. So what's coming in the next 18 to 24 months?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think usually when we think of social media, especially those of us who use it sort of more from a business perspective and not perhaps, we don't necessarily live there, we think Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, Google Plus and perhaps YouTube. So those are the big five that we think about. But there are many emerging social media platforms. Now the thing about social media platforms, I'm hesitant to suggest any particular brand names that are coming out because they come and go so quickly. And there are so many little niche ones that, that only appeal to perhaps people who have an interest in anime, for example. There'll be a social media just for that. However, I'll talk about some trends. So the first trend that we're seeing a lot of is, like I said earlier, social messaging. So anything where people are, instead of looking at setting up a profile and just talking out to people and saying, here's what's happening in my day, and here's what happened at work, and this is what I had for breakfast. Instead of doing that, millennials are very much looking at using social media as a social messaging platform. So things like WhatsApp and things like Facebook Messenger, and together with some other Asian properties that deal in social messaging, far outstretch the number of users on Facebook and Twitter at the moment. So yes,
really?
it's enormous. And so we have to really consider, I think WeChat is one of them. So we have to really consider that social messaging is very much arrived, and it's somewhere we need to look at. Another trend that we see happening quite a lot is live and authentic video. So things like YouTube Live, and also Instagram My Story, Twitter Periscope. These live video facilities offered by the main social media platforms are really taking off. And one of the main reasons for that is because millennials value almost above everything else authenticity. And it's very hard to fake it when you're on video, especially if it's live. Anything can happen. And that's why people tune in, because they want to look at the real person talking about their real selves and what they really offer, and without all of this manufactured background and you know, it's the opposite of fake news, if you like. A third one that we're seeing a lot of talk about, perhaps not so many applications yet, but there's a lot of investment going on into it, which suggests that it's going to come soon, is virtual reality and augmented reality. So Facebook already is working very, very concentratedly on developing a spaces area where they will be able to offer a virtual reality experience. So how might this work for practices? Well, imagine what this might do to what we know now as telemedicine. So inviting somebody into your practice and having them walk around it. It goes well beyond a virtual tour because they're in fact interacting with people who are in the practice. So this creates a virtual reality kind of experience, which might lead to perhaps more adoption.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us here. For more information, please visit eurotimes.org.